Good morning and good afternoon to everybody. Thank you for joining the webinar. We're just opening the doors and letting people come in, so we'll be a couple of minutes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening to everyone. Welcome to our Let's Talk About COP30 webinar. It would be wonderful if you wanted to introduce yourselves in the chat and to say where you're connecting from. I'd also like to just ask Axel, can you paste the link to the presentations in the chat, Axel, so that everybody can access those?
Yeah, for sure. One quick second.
Great. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. Welcome to our briefing. Let's talk about COP30. You can access interpretation for this call through the button with the 3 dots that says more. And then in there you should find interpretation and be able to choose the language channel that works for you. And thank you to our interpreters for the wonderful work that you're doing. We are recording this call, video and audio in English, and we'll additionally be recording audio in Spanish, in Portuguese, in French, and in Bahasa Indonesia. So all of that will be available to you along with the slides. The slides are available during the call and all the other materials soon after. Yeah, this is the first briefing this year in 2025 from the GroundWork team. And I think we've got a good number of people on the call. So I will move ahead and introduce myself and our team, and we'll get into the content of our webinar today. So I'm Philippa Bailey. I'm a scientist and a communicator and an engagement practitioner. And my work is about shifting the climate conversation by building bridges between different groups and communities. Our project here is called GroundWork, Policy Briefings for Action, and we've been delivering briefings since COP28. So this is our sort of second full year of operation. And my colleagues on the project are Paula Alvarado and Lina Salas, and I'd like to offer them the opportunity to introduce themselves. They'll be monitoring the chat and posting resources for you throughout the call. So Paula, would you like to introduce yourself?
Yes, thank you, Philippa. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everybody. As Philippa said, my name is Paula Alvarado. I've been working in this project for the last 2 years, since COP29, working with Philippa and Lina and on a broader team, creating these policy briefings to support the delegations going to these spaces, building bridges, creating the right tools for dialogue. My background is in strategic communications and organizational development. I've been working in this field for over 2 decades, and it's really exciting to be part of this team. So enjoy this session. It's going to be fantastic. Lina, go ahead.
Hi everyone, amazing to see you here today. Good morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you're at. My name is Lina Salas. I am Colombian born and based. I've been working with this team for about 2 years, and I'm very excited to be here supporting any questions or comments you may have on the chat.
Thank you. And we're also delighted to welcome Karina Melo from International Coordinator for APIB from Brazil. So Karina, would you like to say hello?
Hi, everyone. Hello, I'm Karina Melo. As Felipa said, I'm the International Coordinator for APIB, the Articulation of Indigenous Peoples of Brazil, and also APIB's Liaison Officer to the JTC, the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities. And I'm really excited to share our strategies, both from APIB and the JTC, that we are working and were built by indigenous leaders and organizations to COP30.
Thank you so much, Karina. Axel, if you could just move on 2 slides, please, to the GroundWork project. So, and one more, Axel. So just to give a little background to these briefings, it's a collaboration between the International Climate Politics Hub, the Climate and Land Use Alliance, the consultancy Seeds for Change, and TINTA, the Invisible Thread. So we're working together to bring to develop written and virtual policy briefings for Indigenous peoples organizations and local communities and Afro-descendant peoples organizations. We're using the latest policy intelligence from the International Climate Politics Hub and aligning that with Indigenous peoples' priorities and providing those materials in different formats. So this is one of our webinars, but we also produce written briefings. And there's the possibility that if you need tailored support, specific support on your particular region or a topic, please do approach us and we may be able to help you. Although we're a very small team, but we want to respond to people's needs. So just looking at what we're going to cover today, we've had a little introduction, and now we're going to dive into what is COP and really explore the negotiations and how they connect to Indigenous people's priorities. Then Karina is going to share from the APIB point of view, expectations for COP30 and some of the priority issues that they're bringing forward. As part of that, we'll talk about Indigenous mobilization more broadly, and we'll have lots of time for questions and answers towards the end of the webinar. So diving into what is COP, this crazy thing. We're going to be talking about what is the UNFCCC, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, what happens in the negotiations, what happens outside, and how they're all connected. And we'll hear, that there are really many layers to this process. So understanding them and how they connect is important for deciding how we act and how we have impact. So the Framework Convention on Climate Change, along with the Convention on Biological Diversity and the Convention to Combat Desertification, emerged from the Rio Conventions in 1992. And the parties to the Convention on Climate Change are countries. So everything is negotiated between countries. And only 3 countries in the world are not part of the Framework Convention. So that's Iran, Libya, and Yemen. And as you may well know and have heard, the USA is also leaving the convention. And that will happen, that will come into effect in January 2026. But effectively, they are out already, and that does have a big impact. This year is significant, partly because it marks 10 years since the Paris Agreement. And the Paris Agreement was where countries agreed to legally binding text about holding the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees C. And in fact, the number that comes up all the time is 1.5 degrees C. Because of the science, as we understand it, there are many more dangerous impacts that happen if we go above 1.5 degrees C. And the negotiations and what happens at the COP is all geared towards this goal. So this is, if you like, the North Star of the negotiations. And now that a lot of the different agreements have been made, it's about putting this into implementation. So actually making this happen. And the COP is where all of the parties to this agreement come together to discuss and negotiate. So that's an annual meeting. If we just look back at what has happened in the last two COPs, COP28 and COP29. COP28 was in Dubai. You can see the president of the COP there. And the key element there was it was the first global stocktake. So this is the process by which countries look at how well on track they are with the goal of limiting climate change to 2 degrees. And it's no surprise that the answer to that was no, we are not on track. We have made significant changes, and the temperature projections now are much better than they were, but it's still not sufficient for what is needed. And as a result of that process of looking back and reflecting, the Dubai presidency came forward with a proposal which was accepted by all the countries, which was to agree to phase out fossil fuels. And this was important because it was the first time that fossil fuels as the cause of climate change, or one of the causes of climate change, were actually mentioned in the negotiations. To triple the capacity of renewable energy and to double energy efficiency. So those were the important outcomes from COP28. From COP29, which was last year in Azerbaijan, it was the first agreement on a new deal on climate finance to start in 2035. The negotiations were extremely difficult, and they went right to the end of the COP meeting. And finally, countries came up with $300 billion a year by 2035. But crucially, this needs to grow like by 3 or 4 times that amount to at least $1.3 trillion a year. And you might hear the term the Baku to Belém roadmap. So Baku in Azerbaijan to Belém in Brazil, this is the discussion about how to grow that amount from 300 billion to 1.3 trillion. So for indigenous peoples and local communities and Afro-descendant peoples, these are really disappointing outcomes. Not only were the financial agreements inadequate for the scale of the need, but a lot of the finance on offer is not in the form of direct grants to communities, but instead as a form of loans, which can obviously increase indebtedness. And that finance is also not targeted to go directly to communities, but to flow through many, many layers, which often means that the amount that actually reaches territories and communities is very small. Also, there was concerning language, particularly last year, about pulling back from the agreement to phase out fossil fuels. And overall, there's a lack of a rights-based approach, which is so central to indigenous peoples and local communities, Afro-descendant peoples, to put their rights at the center of the negotiations, that it has not been the approach of the UNFCCC process. So overall, I think a very disappointing time for indigenous peoples. Moving on to where we are this year, we're going to be for COP30 in Belém do Pará in Brazil, in the northern part of Brazil, from the 10th to the 21st of November. So it's actually almost a 2-week process. This one is a little bit shorter because they're holding the World Leaders Summit, as it's called, where all of the presidents and prime ministers come. That will be almost before the COP this time, so 3 days before the COP. And Belém is considered the gateway to Brazil's lower Amazon region, so in the northern part of Brazil, and you can see where that is. And it's a small city, so it's a big thing for Belém to be hosting this moment. But for Brazil, this comes on the back of Brazil holding the presidency of the G20 group of nations last year. So they're really taking quite a leading role in international diplomacy. And this is particularly relevant with the US kind of disappearing from the international stage. So what's it actually going to look like? What does a COP look like? Well, it always has these two elements called the blue and the green zones. In Belém, this will be on an old airfield, an old airport, which gives you some idea of the scale of these things. And afterwards, that will be turned into a park for the city. So the green zone is the public side. Axel, if you could just click forward. The green zone is the public side that will have pavilions, stages, talks, but no negotiations. And then the blue zone, if you can click, that will be only people with accreditation. So that means you need to have a link to a country or an organization in order to be able to go into the blue zone. And it's estimated that there will be 30 to 50,000 people with accreditation, of which maybe 1,000 will be indigenous peoples. So that's 2% of the overall population or the overall delegation on the blue zone. And that's compared to maybe 300 to 400 indigenous delegates normally at the COP. But of course, you know, many people will come who won't be in the blue zone. So the total indigenous delegation might be between 3,000 and 5,000 people. And that will be a huge visible force and yeah, will be a really important contribution to how COP30 plays out. So part of what we want to consider today is how can we make sure that the 2% of delegates in the blue zone can really make a big impact and can call on the people outside the blue zone and outside the negotiations to help amplify that impact. So I wonder if it's useful. I came up with this diagram, and if you can just click through another couple of times, Axel. I'm thinking of it like layers of an onion. So at the center, with a very, very small number of people involved, you have the negotiations. And then you have layers operating around that, getting ever more into the public spaces and to bigger numbers of people. So right in the outer layer, we might see the public and media conversations and campaigns. So those two arrows on the right-hand side show this is getting more public as we go up, and the visibility is getting less as we go into the heart of the negotiations, because it's really not easy for ordinary people to see what is happening in those negotiations. So we can hold this image in mind, and we might come back to it later and see if it generates interesting thoughts for people. So let's dive now into the negotiations themselves and how they work in relation to indigenous peoples. So next slide, Axel. So there isn't just one track of negotiations because the UNFCCC process is so complex. There are multiple parallel tracks focused on different issues like mitigation, adaptation, loss and damage, carbon markets, food and nature. And so if you're really going to get involved or pay attention to the negotiations, you probably want to just choose one track and try and follow that, because every day there's a huge schedule of events happening and they're all happening in parallel. So it's quite difficult to follow lots of things at the same time. And each negotiation moves forward by consensus. So that means everybody in the room has to agree. And that makes it a very slow and difficult process sometimes. So if you imagine a room with 197 lawyers trying to agree, you know, coming from countries with very different perspectives, different forms of governance, different industries. What countries have opted to do in many situations is to form negotiating groups. So, and that helps them to advocate more effectively for what they want. So, for example, the Association of Small Island States is a group that represents many of the small islands that are particularly affected by rising sea levels. So there's a lot of frustration with this process, both within the process, because there are several countries, and you can imagine which ones they are. They're the ones with very strong fossil fuel interests that often hold back the negotiations and object to stronger language or greater ambition. So there's frustration inside, there's also frustration outside the process, and many proposals for reform, particularly because as the negotiations get more complicated, the whole process gets bigger, it gets more expensive, it's more difficult to actually run it, and we run the risk that people lose track of the connections between the issues. For example, the connections between climate and nature, which I think certainly from Indigenous people's perspective is an absolutely obvious connection. They have become divorced in these negotiations. There are big concerns at the moment about multilateralism, about countries' willingness to work together, and that's what we're seeing in the US, pulling out of these kinds of spaces. And it could be that Indigenous knowledge has a lot to bring into this space of how to reach consensus coming from very different places, how to have effective discussions over time. And it would be wonderful to see that influence the process more. The talks, the negotiations are ongoing throughout the year. COP is a big moment, but there's also halfway through the year, which is just coming up next week, there will be the talks in Bonn, which are called the intersessional talks. So that's like halfway through each year, and some of the negotiations happen there as well. So moving on, what status do Indigenous peoples have in the UNFCCC? So Indigenous peoples organizations are one of 9 official constituencies that have observer status in this process. So other constituencies include the Women and Gender constituency, the Business constituency, and then the Environmental NGO constituency. And those constituencies can be very effective when they work together. But really, they are only able to observe the negotiations and make comments on the negotiations. So they really need supportive parties, countries, to put their points of view forward and advocate for them in the negotiations. In terms of Indigenous peoples organizations, there's a caucus, and the caucus is called the International Indigenous Peoples Forum on Climate Change. You can see their symbol here in the right-hand side. And they organize a meeting every day for all Indigenous peoples inside the Blue Zone to find out what the issues are that are being negotiated and to make contributions to that. There's also just newly developed a youth caucus, so that's elevating the voices of young Indigenous people within the constituency. The other group that I want to, or the other key mechanism within the process that I want to point out is the Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples platform. And that brings Indigenous peoples together with parties, so with countries from the 7 sociocultural regions. And the idea of the platform is that it's about exchanging knowledge, building capacity, and collaboration with the UNFCCC. So they organize, for example, a knowledge holders gathering every year at the COP. And they also have every year an annual pre-COP meeting. So if you want to be present for the LCIPP, then you need to go and register and be there before the official talks start. Great, let's move on. So I've talked about Indigenous peoples organizations being an observer constituency. So the question comes, well, how can Indigenous peoples shape what happens in the COP? And for sure, there is structural exclusion in the way that Indigenous peoples can participate, because this is a country-led process. And obviously then it depends very much what the relationship is between Indigenous peoples and their nation state. But despite the difficulties, there has been a huge effort over time to raise the profile of Indigenous peoples' voices. And COP30 is really a special opportunity to do that even more. So the ways that people have done that effectively so far is by talking to parties before the COP. So really knowing their national governments, being in conversation where that's possible with their country delegation, and even Indigenous representatives within the country delegation going to the COP under their country badge. There are many active working groups within the caucus looking at issues like finance, looking at carbon markets, looking at adaptation, loss and damage. And they develop position papers for the caucus that then can be shared and submitted. They're able to comment on negotiations as observers. And the presidency also holds events to raise Indigenous peoples' priorities. So this picture on the right here is an example from Azerbaijan about Indigenous leadership and traditional knowledge, featuring many Indigenous leaders. Indigenous people also have the chance to speak in the opening and closing ceremonies, and you can find a link to, I think, the closing ceremony contribution. Something that is new and really important this year is that Indigenous peoples of the Amazon, of the 9 Amazon countries, have just met in Brasilia, in Brazil, for an Indigenous pre-COP, and really worked hard to articulate their demands and their priorities for COP30. And you can find a link to that also in the notes with the slides. So we're still in this business of the negotiations, and some of the topics that will be negotiated this year include the progress towards those outcomes of the global stocktake that I mentioned before. So the phasing out of fossil fuels, the tripling of renewables, and the doubling of energy efficiency, and how to actually make that happen. This includes something called the Just Transition Work Programme, which is about how to help countries' economies transition from being based on fossil fuels to being based around alternative sources of energy. And the just transition is a really important topic for Indigenous peoples and local communities, because it has implications for forests and land use, and also the extraction of what are called transition minerals. So resources that will support making all the batteries and electrification that the transition requires. And those resources are often found on Indigenous lands. And again, you can find a link in the presentation to a declaration made by Indigenous peoples on just transition from a meeting held at the end of last year. Another element in the negotiations is this Baku to Belém roadmap, this growing of the climate finance from 300 billion to $1.3 trillion. And this is climate finance for mitigation, for adaptation, and for loss and damage. So 3 of the important legs of the stool, if you like. And one thing that is critical to make progress with this year is the global goal on adaptation, which is about how are we going to cope, how are our communities going to cope with the increasing temperatures. Also this year, it's the deadline for countries to submit their nationally determined contributions, which is where they say how they're going to bring down their carbon emissions over time to be in line with 1.5 degrees. And the deadline for this was actually 9 to 12 months before COP30. So most people have missed the deadline because actually only very few of these nationally determined contributions have been generated. But countries can update them at any time. And this is an important area for indigenous peoples where they can engage with their national governments to make sure that their views and their priorities are represented in the NDCs. Okay, I'm sorry, I've been talking for a long time and I know you probably want a break, but we're just going to go a little bit beyond the negotiations because many of the key issues that have a high public profile and are very important for indigenous peoples, local communities and Afro-descendant peoples are not part of the negotiations at all, but wrap around in the next layer. So that would include what we call the action agenda. Axel, if you can move on. The action agenda is not just about countries, parties, but is about including business, philanthropies, and civil society. And the interesting thing about the action agenda is it does not require consensus between all parties to move forwards. So that means in a way it can be much more ambitious in what it tries to do, and those who agree can sign on. So many of the declarations that you will see come from the action agenda. And some of the key people in the action agenda are called the climate champions. And Brazil has 3 climate champions this year. So Sinea Wapichana, who is the indigenous climate champion. She is from Roraima in the Amazon. Marcele Oliveira, the youth champion. She's pictured here with President Lula. And Dan Ioshpe, who is from the automotive industry and brought the industry together around the G20 process. There's also the climate champion from last year from Azerbaijan. And unfortunately, Razan Al-Mubarak, who was the climate champion for the UAE, she's no longer a climate champion, but she was a really big supporter of indigenous people's rights. And she set in place a piece of research about the contribution of indigenous knowledge to climate action. And that is still ongoing. So that's going to be an important piece of work that expresses the important contribution that indigenous knowledge can make to climate action. Another issue that is really strong that comes up, not so much inside the negotiations, but around the negotiations, is the call for land tenure and the link to direct finance. So this means directly funding indigenous peoples' organizations, not going through international NGOs or through governments, but empowering those organizations to be able to spend money in the way that makes sense in their territories. And this is an agenda that has risen up outside the negotiations. And 2 different ways that we sort of see that happening, if you can go to the next slide, Axel. There is what's called the Land Tenure Pledge. So there was a pledge back at COP26 in Glasgow for $1.7 billion from governments and from philanthropies combined towards land tenure for indigenous peoples and local communities. And that has been mostly implemented now by 2024 and has supported 166 different indigenous, local community and Afro-descendant organizations. But the hope is that at COP30 there will be a commitment to a new and larger pledge towards a land tenure. But that is still hanging in the balance because some governments are excited to contribute and some are cautious about that, and the same with philanthropic funders. So we have to wait and see whether that happens. But it's interesting to read about what happened with the first pledge and also what has been learned about how to channel money directly to communities. The second element that I just wanted to to point out, Axel, if you can go to the next slide, is the Tropical Forests Forever Facility, the TFFF. This has been proposed by the Brazilian government and it will be launched at COP30. And the idea of the TFFF is it's a financial mechanism to protect standing forest. So it's not about restoring forest or preventing changing land use. It's about preserving the standing forest. And the idea would be that governments and the private sector make investments, and then some of the money that is made on the back of that, so some of the interest, is returned to indigenous peoples and local communities. And the idea is that that might be about 20%. And indigenous groups have been engaged in this process in terms of thinking about how this could work for them. So including the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, who have been part of the TFF process. And you can read their statement on how they are thinking about this. Again, linked from the presentation notes. And outside the formal process, there's always an Indigenous Peoples Pavilion. This on the left here, that was the picture in Azerbaijan. It was not such a colorful place, but normally it's a really colorful place, a wonderful place for people to come together and meet each other and talk about their experiences in their territories, in their communities, the action they're taking and the results that that's having. And also there are many Indigenous-led side events. For example, this was one with the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, again about direct funding. And those are really important places to raise the visibility of Indigenous priorities. So yeah, I've talked a lot. Thank you for listening, and we'll just take a little breath here and a pause for reflection, thinking about how all of this connects. And I'd love to hear your reflections in the chat and your questions for us and for each other. So again, if we just move to the next slide, Axel, in case it's helpful, here is the onion again. So now we know about the negotiations. If you can click through, Axel, we've got the action agenda wrapping around that. We've got the side events. We've got the green zone. We've got the mobilizations, so demonstrations that can take place both within the blue and the green zones and more widely. And then we've got the sort of public and media conversations and campaigns. And it would be great if people wanted to reflect, where are the spaces where I want to make an impact? And how can I connect to that? And how can I connect between these spaces so that we can all be bridges, helping information and solidarity to move from one layer of the onion to the next. So maybe let's just take a couple of minutes, and if you've got thoughts and ideas, also if you are planning events at COP30 and you want to share those with other people, this would be a great moment to put them into the chat so others can find out about what you're doing. And I see in the chat, everybody on the call today will have access to the presentations, and actually you can access the presentations right now. Paula has just shared the link. So there you have the presentations in English, Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Bahasa Indonesia. And so please do, download those, share those, use them as you, and come back to us if you think we've made mistakes. That's also important. So yeah, if you have events that you know are going to be happening in COP30 that you would like to share with others, or questions or ideas about where you want to be in the onion. I see somebody asking a question about how Indigenous delegates can have access to the Blue Zone without accreditation. It won't be possible without accreditation. So I know, and Karina may speak more about this, but the Brazilian government is trying to negotiate, or the indigenous people are negotiating with the Brazilian presidency to have 500 Brazilian indigenous delegates in the Blue Zone and another 500 from other countries in the world. And it may be that people, indigenous delegates wanting to attend, need to be part of their country delegation in order to go into the Blue Zone. But nobody without accreditation can enter the Blue Zone, unfortunately. It's very strict, and it becomes UN territory for the time of the COP. The Green Zone does not need accreditation, so that's open to members of the public. So anybody can go into the Green. It's free. You get a ticket for the day. So yeah, that's open to everyone. And again, Karina will probably talk about it, but there's going to be an indigenous COP ongoing at the same time as the official UN COP. So also people will be able to participate in that. So there'll be a lot of activity outside this green and blue zone that I've spoken about, that people will be able to participate in. I see Wendy's question about deadlines. I'm sorry, I don't have the date to hand, but about side events, but it will be coming up very soon, and often the window is small. So I would check on the UNFCCC site or on the COP30 site, the Brazilian COP30 site, 30th of June. Thank you. This is great intelligence. And it's important to have, you know, to have a little network of organizations or to have partners that you want to present with, and really for at least one of those organizations to have accreditation and experience of doing these things already at COP. Yeah. Great. Well, I think we should move on to Karina's presentation, which will give much more detail about from the Brazilian perspective, Brazilian indigenous perspective. So thank you so much, Karina.
Thank you, Felipe. I'm going to share my screen. I think I need Excel to stop sharing first. Okay, thank you. Do you see my screen? Yes? Okay, great. So hi again, everyone. So now, based on all that Felipe shared, I'm going to present how those really global level conversations, talks, strategies can be useful, tailored to a national perspective for the protection of indigenous people's rights. So first, I'll start with a brief presentation about APIB's advocacy strategy for COP30, then our global campaign, The Answer Is Us, then more information about what Felipe just shared in terms of indigenous participation at COP30, including the People Summit, the Indigenous COP, and also the Indigenous Pavilion at the Blue Zone. And we have new governance bodies for indigenous peoples, as the People's Circle at COP30 presidency, and within the circle, the International Indigenous Commission for COP30. And we have an annex here. I don't think that because of time I will present it, but everybody will have access to the presentation. So if you want to check what specific body from the federal government of Brazil or state level of Pará you want to engage for a specific matter, so you know who to approach. So, yeah. So APIB's main demand for COP30, I mean, we have a list of demands related to mitigation, adaptation, climate finance, but our main demand, the leaders have decided, is that COP30 leaves a concrete legacy on land demarcation and protection. So COP30, I mean, itself, it's an event of 2 weeks and we have like a huge mobilization from all of us since a while, specifically for this event. And so what the leaders have said is that what stays after COP30. So our measure of success for the Brazilian perspective of COP30, it will be if COP30 is able to deliver a concrete legacy on land demarcation protection. And when we say about a concrete legacy, it's not only about political announcements and commitments, but a feasible, concrete implementation plan for land demarcation and protection of indigenous territories. So here we have, I mean, it's a lot of information, but here we have it more detailed, and our combined strategies to ensure that we are able to have this landmark of land demarcation at COP30. So here there's a lot of text, so maybe it's more useful if I introduce it here. So there's this platform, the FCOP, the Forest Climate Leaders Partnership. It's a platform of countries, only states, launched at COP26 in Glasgow. And this platform, it was convened for the commitment to zero deforestation until 2030 and other political commitments. And now through the GATC, the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, we are engaging with FCOP countries and others to have a first announcement, a global announcement of land tenure pledge at COP30 with specific goals for land recognition in terms of hectares for each country. So that's something really important to happen, because with that, it would be the first time that countries would make this really high level commitment, recognizing the importance of land, of indigenous peoples and local communities, territories for the climate agenda. So again, this is a global pledge, but we hope to have a specific pledge for Brazil. And in parallel, we are advocating for inclusion, what we're calling the indigenous NDC. This NDC brings several proposals from collective moments and workshops that we had with several indigenous leaders about adaptation, mitigation, but one specific demand that we really want to include in the Brazilian NDC is the Brazilian state's recognition of land demarcation as a climate mitigation policy. And why is that? Brazil already recognizes the right of indigenous peoples to land tenure and land demarcation. However, due to the current political context in Brazil, our Congress is dominated by the agribusiness. So we are currently and ongoing facing several proposals of setbacks, including constitutional amendments on land rights. So this idea of recognizing demarcation as a climate mitigation policy is to reinforce what is already recognized as a right in Brazil, but also as the climate agenda is getting more and more importance, also to understand the importance that land demarcation plays in the role of fighting climate change, because specifically in the case of Brazil, deforestation counts for over 70% of our national CO2 emissions, and indigenous lands are the least deforested. So that's also why it's important to have this official recognition of demarcation as a climate mitigation policy within our NDC. Then we have in Brazil the National Climate Plan, which is divided between the adaptation and mitigation plan. And the idea we're working to get this is to have specific demarcation targets and implementation timeline detailed in the National Climate Plan. Then, as Felipe said, we have those two other initiatives, the TFFF and also the Finance Pledge, which is being pushed by the FTFG, the Tenure Funders Group, this group of governments and philanthropy, to make this at least 1.7 billion new announcement, new pledge at COP30. And the TFFF hopes to raise $125 billion. So through the GATC, again, we are really working to have a minimum, and actually in our last Brazzaville Congress, we set a minimum of 40%, but currently in those initiatives, specifically on the TFF, we're working to set a minimum 20% allocation of direct funding of those $125 billion to indigenous peoples and local communities organizations directly. So, but besides direct funding, which is really important to ensure the autonomy and also to recognize the leading role of indigenous peoples and local communities in fighting climate change, especially for the TFF, 80% of the funds raised would be directed to states. And our goal is that this, or at least a percentage of this amount, is directed to land demarcation and protection public policies in Brazil. And to channel those funds, we are proposing a new PPTAL. And PPTAL, it was a land protection program for the Amazon region that we had about 20 years ago. It was created in the context of ECHO 92. And the idea of this program, this program was a really interesting experience and pilot program because it had a three-party governance between the Brazilian government, the international cooperation, but also indigenous organizations. And this was the most effective program that we had in Brazil ever for demarcating indigenous lands, channeling resources from the international cooperation. So that's how, in terms of advocacy, our strategy currently to make sure that we have not only a political announcement, which is really important because it sets the narrative and makes public pressure, but also to have concrete implementation of this announcement to make sure that we have demarcation as a legacy of COP30 in Brazil. To support all this work, we have indigenous governance bodies. So besides the UNFCCC Local Communities and Indigenous Peoples Platform and the Indigenous Caucus that Felipe already mentioned, we now have this new proposal for COP30, which is the International Indigenous Commission, which I'll talk more soon. And also we have Sineo Apishana as the Indigenous Special Envoy. That increases our dialogue spaces with key stakeholders and decision makers, not only from the Brazilian government, but also from the UNFCCC, to pressure for all of those to be implemented. And then in terms of a broader awareness raise in terms of civil society in general to gain track and to support the indigenous movement demand, we have our global campaign, The Answer Is Us, to bring visibility to our demands, not only about demarcation, but also I'll present the campaign now. So The Answer Is Us is a campaign that was created by the Brazilian indigenous movement, but it's not only for the Brazilian indigenous movement. It's our proposal, and here's also our invitation for every organization that identifies with the campaign's key messages to be part of this initiative. So, as I said, the campaign is our global awareness raising initiative for COP30, so really focused on communications, and it intends to bring visibility to our key, but also common climate demands. And as I said, it is born from the Brazilian indigenous movement, but it's not limited to indigenous peoples, not only to the Brazilian region. We really want, and the campaign already is actually a global campaign that embraces all social movements and all peoples. So the idea of this campaign is to have, as I said, global key messages, but at the very local level, not only national, but at the territorial level, those demands, although more general in the phrasing of the campaign, they really represent local struggles and local goals of our communities. And which are our answers, or the challenges that we are facing and the answers that we are providing to the climate crisis. So the next I will present the 5 key messages, the answers of the campaign. So the first is that land rights equals climate action. As Felipe said, the rights-based approach, land rights were never at the center of climate negotiations, despite the enormous contribution of indigenous and local communities' lands to fight climate crisis. So we really expect COP30 to be a turning point on this, not only in terms about the negotiation, but also specifically about the climate agenda, to have land rights at the center of climate negotiations and discussions. Also zero deforestation, and in the local or national level, that may be translated into several different initiatives that each of our regions are carrying out, but also proposals for the government as commodity traceability, I don't know, that may be linked to several initiatives that your organization is promoting. So no fossil fuels, yes, we really support and demand the energy transition, but without mining in indigenous and local communities' territories. This is really important because that's the trend that we have been seeing already, and it has already been reflected in initiatives to change legislations to allow for mining indigenous lands. In the case of Brazil, that is not allowed constitutionally, so that's one of the things that we are facing now. And also to protect the defenders, to protect their ways of lives, because the defenders are the ones, if the territories are those last standing points in terms of our possibility to fight climate change, they are there because of the defenders, because of the peoples who live there. So it's really important also to consider the individual's perspective and the traditional ways of life of the communities from the territories. So those are the 5 demands and answers of the campaign. And we have a global mobilization calendar. Our idea is to really gain track in this next semester. So when we arrive at COP30, we really want to make COPs to be back to COPs of the people. So we want to have a strong popular and manifestation presence at COP, and we will only be able to do that together. And also if we are increasingly making mobilizations together, coordinated manifestations in the next semester. So here's our calendar for global mobilizations this semester. So in July, probably on July 18th, that's to be confirmed. That's the only date to be confirmed yet. In August, on August 27, in parallel to Rio Climate Week. September 21st, several organizations are organizing a global manifestation between September 19th until 21st. And our idea is to call for a global march on September 21st. In October, as Felipe said, there's always an official pre-COP. And this year's pre-COP will take place between October 13th and 14th. And we want to make a huge manifestation the first day of the pre-COP, including an indigenous march here in Brasilia. And finally, in November, we actually expect the whole month, the whole COP days to be focused on our manifestations, mobilizations, our demands. But specifically, we will have in Berlin the Global March of the Peoples on November 15th. So those are the dates for, as I said, the global mobilization days, but also as this campaign is, it's global, it's of you all, of all of the organizations that see themselves in the messages that I shared. So you are also invited to make more mobilizations in your territorial level, your national level. So you may access the campaign's website. Actually, now we still don't have our calendar there, nor the mobilization materials, but it will be updated by the end of this month. So you may access these banners here that we have for the messages and print them and make and we'll have them in Portuguese, English, French, Spanish, and Bahasa. And you may print them to make your manifestations, but you also may make your own and be part of this mobilization. So here's the campaign website. As I said, it should be soon updated. Now you unfortunately won't find much information there, but by the end of the month it will be complete. You may contact us through this email, and as of now, you may start using the campaign's hashtags. These are the hashtags in each of the 5 official languages of the campaign. And also here, there's a link where you may already find those banners that I shared here in the 5 languages. Okay, so this was for our global campaign. I really hope that more organizations join us in this initiative and be part of this answer, be part of the global mobilizations. And now I will share more about specific spaces for the indigenous participation at COP30. So we have the People's Summit. The People's Summit is an international coalition. Also, it was created from Brazilian social movements, but now it's an international coalition of over 500 social movements and civil society organizations who gathered in 2023 during the Amazon Summit in Belém. Also, we already knew by then that Brazil was going to host COP30 this year. So it was, this coalition was created to already coordinate between organizations to have a joint and significant participation across social movements at COP30. So the main demands of the People's Summit is global climate justice, protection of human rights, any transition that does not burden the most vulnerable, and the recognition of agroecology as a viable alternative. We have indigenous organizations as members of the People's Summit, including APIB, COIAB, which is the Brazilian indigenous organization for the Amazon region, and OPIAC, the Colombian indigenous organization for the Amazon region. And in total, including all social movements, including the indigenous delegation, the People's Summit expects to gather at least 15,000 people in Belém, but for the first week of COP only. So here are the dates for the People's Summit, opening on November 12th. Between November 13th and 14th, we'll have thematic plenaries. The Global March of the Peoples, as I said, on November 15th, and then on November 16th, the closing plenary. And here you may find the website, contact email, and Instagram page for the People's Summit. In parallel of the People's Summit, because as I said, People's Summit will gather all social movements, so these plenaries will not only be focused about indigenous peoples or local communities, but other segments as well. So we'll have a specific indigenous COP, which will be complementary to the People's Summit, taking place in parallel to it. So occurring during the same dates, and the expected delegation is of 3,000 to 5,000 indigenous peoples at a global scale. As Felipa said, we are not, because there are several constraints because of logistics, and even the UNFCCC intends to shrink in general the participation or the total participation in the Blue Zone. We won't be able to have all those 15,000 peoples from the People's Summit or the 3,000 to 5,000 indigenous peoples being part of the Blue Zone. But not only because of that, the leaders won't be there, they will be there, they'll be able to have their specific space to share their proposals, to exchange experiences, and to claim for their demands. So this is the idea of the Indigenous COP. And one of the things that we are working together with the GHC is to have, during the program, which is not open yet for proposals, but to have a specific day for the Indigenous Pledge, where we hope that indigenous-led funding mechanisms will be able to announce call for proposals for projects led by indigenous organizations. So that's one of the ideas that we have for the agenda of the Indigenous COP, which will be in an Indigenous Maloca as a reference space, but the specific location of the Indigenous Maloca is still to be defined. I'll share more about it here in this slide. So also we'll have the Indigenous Pavilion at the Blue Zone. So the Indigenous Pavilion is our reference space for the Indigenous agenda. at the official venue of the COP. And our demand, because it's usually it's nice, expected to have a specific space, but it's usually a really small space. So we're demanding for a bigger and better positioned pavilion at the Blue Zone. And the call for proposals, I saw a presentation from the Brazilian government. It seems, because I saw that somebody asked about it in the chat, it seems that it was going to be open in August, but usually it's sooner. Usually it takes place by end June or early July. But so this may not be accurate, but that's the last I saw from a meeting of the Brazilian government last week. And for the indigenous pavilion, because there are specific, there are a different process to send event proposals for the Blue Zone side events and another for the indigenous pavilion. So for the indigenous pavilion, I don't know the date. I don't know if anybody here is aware about the expected date for submitting proposals. So here's a bit map about our 3 reference spaces. So here's COP30 official venue, as Felipa shared previously. Here we'll have the People's Summit. The program will take place at the Federal University of the State of Pará, UFPA. And here it will be at the Escola de Aplicação, the application school of the same university, the place where it will be the indigenous camp and lodging, with a capacity of 3,000 people. More or less. So what's still, but here, what is defined at here will be this place, the place for the camping, the accommodation of the indigenous delegation. But for the indigenous COP, we're still not sure if it will take place here at the same accommodation place or here at the same venue of the People's Summit. So that's what's still pending to be defined. And here we also have the distance between those locations. So okay, I'm running short on time, so to conclude, I would like to talk briefly about those new IPs governance bodies at COP30. So the Brazilian COP presidency announced early this year these new circles space. So this is something new. We hadn't had something similar to that for the previous COP, but now the Brazilian presidency hopes that this initiative is also a legacy from its presidency for the next COP, so that those circles are remained for next COP. So we have the Global Ethical Balance Circle, the Finance Minister Circle, for instance. This circle is responsible for the roadmap from Baku to Belém, as Felipa shared, which intends to mobilize the 1.3 trillion by COP30, the President's Circle, which gathers presidents from the former COPs, and the People's Circle. The People's Circle, it's led by Minister Sônia Guajajara, the Brazilian Minister of Indigenous Peoples, and it hopes to improve the dialogue between indigenous peoples, traditional and local communities, and Afro-descendants in the COP30 presidency. So in terms of a diagram, it will be those 4 circles, and within the people circles, we have at least 2 commissions. The International Commission for Local Communities and Afro-descendants. I'm not sure if this commission, it will be separated into 2, one for local communities and one for Afro-descendants. Maybe not, maybe they will be together. But also we have the International Commission for Indigenous Peoples. So the mandate of this commission, again, is to improve the dialogue between the movement, social movement, with COP30 presidency and beyond the negotiation agenda, including also the action agenda, COP30 program, logistics, for instance. This commission is the one responsible to obtain the 1,000 credentials for indigenous peoples in Brazil, being 500 for Brazilian indigenous peoples and 500 for indigenous peoples worldwide. So we're not sure, we're facing several challenges with this goal, but that's the role of the commission to represent our demands within the Brazilian government and within COP30 presidency. So here we have members of the commission. So it's also led, not only the Minister Sônia Guajajara chairs both the People's Circle, but also the International Commission. And we have the members of the commission currently. They are some regions of the Indigenous Caucasus, Asia, Africa, and Latin so far, the UN Permanent Forum on Indigenous Issues, the GHC, APIB, COIAB, AMIGA. AMIGA is the National Organization of Indigenous Women, the G9 of the Amazon Basin, with the 9 indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin, IPRI, and also the General Secretary of the Presidency of the Republic. So now, because of COP being taking place in Brazil, we have more representation of indigenous organizations from Brazil, besides, of course, the GHC, the Caucasus, and the Permanent Forum. But we hope that for next COPs, then Brazilian organizations would move out from the Commission, and then Australian indigenous organizations would come in. So this commission will have its next meeting in Bonn on June 22nd, and if you're there, please feel free to join the meeting as well. So yes, I think I spoke a lot. In a nutshell, that's all for me. Now we have this annex, as I said, about key stakeholders in Brazil. So you may know who is who and who is responsible for what. So you know who to approach if you want to advocate or to demand for a specific matter. But yeah, that's all for me now. Thank you.
Wow, thank you so much, Karina. You've shared so much brilliant information with us. People are asking in the chat how to stay connected to, for example, the Indigenous COP and how the camp goes forward, and how to secure a place there. How should they follow APIB on social media, or is there a list or something like that? How can people find out?
Yes, of course. The campaign website will be the most updated with information, but in the slides I shared our email and social media networks as well. But I will put it here in the chat.
Great. And if we can go back, Axel, to my slides. We've just got time now for some questions and answers. I would also, so if you feel confident to ask a question out loud, we would love to hear your voice. I'm also going to just put in the chat a little feedback survey that we have, because we really love to know what you think about this kind of briefing, and what you feel you've learned from it, and what we could do better next time. So I'm going to put that in as well. There you can see the Google Forms link. So great, we've got offers. Yes, Karina's presentation is within the presentations that we shared with you. So the Google Drive folder that has the 5 different language presentations, Karina's slides are already within there. So you can find all of the information that she shared, the social media, the email addresses, and the links are all in there. I do apologize that at the moment the slides that are in English are still in English, because I haven't had the chance to translate them yet, but I will try and do that and update the files in the Google Drive. But you can use that Google Drive. That will always be the place where you can find the presentations and then the transcripts and other materials from this briefing that you can share. So yeah, please do take a moment to fill out our survey. It has been wonderful to see how much conversation has happened in the chat. I hope if you've had questions that they have been answered by my colleagues here on the call. And if you want to raise your hand and ask a question now, then you're very welcome to do so as well. So Marie-Ange is asking, what is the relationship with COICA? I guess that's a question for you, Karina, with APIB. maybe you could just explain, because Brazil has this wonderful complexity of indigenous people's organizations.
Yes, COICA is one of the member organizations of the GATC, the Global Alliance of Territorial Communities, and the member organizations of COICA, the 9 indigenous organizations of the Amazon Basin. They are organized in the G9 of the Amazon Basin as their climate coalition. So that's why also the G9 is a member of the International Commission of Indigenous Peoples, and the representation of the G9 in this commission is OPIAC.
Kari, there was a question on the Q&A of somebody asking for a clarification on what's happening in September 21st on the mobilizations.
Yes, I unfortunately I can't share much now because I'm still not quite up to date on this global initiative, but there's some partner organizations are organizing this global mobilization between September 19th until September 21st. And our idea is to have street manifestations on September 21st as the closing day of this mobilization. But as soon as we have more information, we'll have this calendar of mobilizations and all the related information updated in the campaign's website. And of course, we'll always use our WhatsApp group chat to share about those.
I'll just respond here to Natalia asking about presenting a topic in the green zone. Yeah, you will have to wait until the application's open to submit your event, but it's a really good idea to do all of the planning beforehand so that you have your partner organization set up, and even so that you know where you might host the event. So in the green zone, there are often some stages, but there are also pavilions hosted by different people. So Colombia, for example, may have a pavilion in the green zone. They will certainly have a blue zone pavilion. And it can be really good to host events within country pavilions because there's a sort of natural audience there. The challenge with COP is that there's so many things going on simultaneously that it's really difficult to get a big audience for any one event. So just to hold that in mind, you know, in a way, you might have a physical event, but just as important might be to reach out virtually, you know, and sometimes events from the green zone are live streamed. And that can be really good to reach a much bigger audience, or to have a sort of social media campaign and presence going on around your event, because capturing people's attention in the middle of COP is very challenging. I hope that doesn't sound too negative. Yeah, and somebody else asking about the site for registration to COP30. There isn't an open registration to attend COP30, so there isn't. It isn't an open process like that. You have to go through an accredited organization who will have a certain number of badges allocated to them, and you go through that organization. So you need to look up on the list of organizations of who is accredited, and they will get a certain number of badges each. The other route is to go through your national government, because parties, so national governments, are able to take any number of people in their delegation to the COP. So that is in a way the most flexible source of badges, but of course it's not always realistic, because you may not have those entry points into your government, or it may even be dangerous to try and build those links. But yeah, that is the most flexible source of blue zone badges. And organizations, yeah, right now do not know how many badges they have. So we're still 6 months away from the COP. And so they will not know for I guess at least a couple of months probably how many badges they will have, and therefore who in their organization is going to go, and whether they've got any spare badges. But like I say, the party overflow route, which is through national governments, is the most flexible source of Blue Zone badges. And yes, I'll look for the link of accredited organizations just now, and I will include that in the resources and update that in the presentation if I can't find it now. I can see the name for delegates. It depends a little bit on the route that you're doing. You can end up getting badges much later than that, but they have to. You have to, you know, have a route through an organization that has badges allocated to them. Then the names can be changed until quite late in the day. That's to answer Tom's question there. Okay. There will be Nicaraguan and Honduran organizations that are accredited, certainly, and there are Nicaraguan indigenous representatives who have important roles in the COP. So you could also reach out to them. I can put some names in the chat. And certainly there will be a recording of this call. There will also be the audio in Spanish, Portuguese, French, and Bahasa Indonesia. And we will try and provide a transcript in each of those languages as well. And of course, you're very welcome, and we would love you to share the slides. So through the link to the Google Drive that we have shared in this in the chat here. We will also email you all directly with that link so that you can access all of the information from today. Great. Thank you very much, everybody, for your contributions to the chat. You have made it a really amazingly lively webinar, which is so welcome for us. I want to say thank you to Karina from APIB for her really important, detailed information about how to participate in the COP30. And even if you're not in Belém, even if you're not in Brazil, there are lots of ways to be part of this and to amplify the Answer Is Us campaign, and to make your contributions there as well. So don't feel like if I can't get to Brazil, it's all over. It's not. It's still, we can, if we're going to have a global movement of people, we're not all going to be in the same place at the same time, and that's okay. Yeah, I want to also thank my colleagues, Lina and Paula and Julia, and to all of the team at TINTA, to our amazing interpreters who've made this accessible in other languages, and to the behind the scenes team at TINTA who've been supporting the whole webinar. Thank you so much. Please do join our WhatsApp group. I think Lina put the link in the chat. It's also in the slides. If you want to find out about our other briefings, we will be doing briefings on transition minerals and the energy transition later in the year, and then another briefing in the run-up to COP30, so just before COP30. So please do join our WhatsApp group. There you can see it under the newsletters and groups that Axel has just shared. And yeah, we look forward to staying in touch with you. Please do get in touch if you've got ideas or things that you would like to know that we haven't covered today. Thank you and goodbye.